Yeah, way. Okay, so today we're going to talk about some basic songwriting ideas, and there's a common phrase used about escaping the loop when it comes to producing music. So we're just going to talk about that quick for an hour and give some basic examples starting off with those topics. So again, um, starting out, got project just loaded up in Ableton as an example, but this won't be Ableton specific stuff. This is just, using some just really generic examples of some instrumental parts here in Ableton to demonstrate the ideas that I'm talking about. So applicable to any DAW, not just Ableton. But to start out with, as usual, I've got my master channel here with the headphone monitoring software and just the streaming software stuff loaded down here. So nothing to worry about there, just what I have going on. And then the rest of the project here, I just whipped up something quick to demonstrate examples of what I'm talking about here. So escape the loop is often a term used because it's common that people are producing music, especially electronic music, and they come up with a cool idea or a cool loop, and they have a little, like a, say, like a drum beat going and a little melody, maybe a bass line and something. But then they feel like they're having a hard time expanding that into a full, fleshed out song. Feeling so-called stuck in the loop. Because if you have a loop and it just, the loop plays once, twice, it sounds good. That's cool. But then what do you do with it to turn it into into a full piece of music, actually? So there's some really simple ways to approach thinking about that that I'm going to talk about. It is first and foremost not like the, authoritative guide on every technique to do this or something. These are just some simple, basic kind of starter ideas that you can use to kind of launch into thinking about that. And we're starting with the most simple, basic examples that I can think of, in a sense. But then, yeah, like most things, these are things to just begin experimenting with on your own, and then it becomes intuitive, and you will be able to expand them into more complex and more unique ideas yourself. So to start out with, we're talking about a loop, for example. And so like a common example is like maybe you started with a loop that can often be a really good thing, like your main idea, say it can be your main idea of your track where you think, boy, I have this drum beat and this bass line and little melody thing, and they really go well together. I really like it. And that can be great. That can be a solid foundation of what your whole track is going to be. And there are ways to think about how to expand that and go beyond, just that simple loop that you have started into several variations of it, several different ideas to compose a whole song. And that's a key term there, variations. Like, how can you take the idea that you started and create some variety of that same kind of theme and core concept? And that's basically what we're talking about here today. So to start that out, I will just give you an example of how I built out this tune as an example to go through. Again, example, not like we're writing the greatest piece of music of all time here or something, but this is just to demonstrate the purposes I'm talking about here. So I will walk through how I just made this arrangement here quite quickly to demonstrate that. So I did start with the basic idea of a loop. So first, I just use a drum loop sample here rather than making some drums. Just threw in a quick drum and bass drum loop here, and so I threw in one loop here. It is this loop here. Plays once. And then I duplicated that 1, 2, 3, 4 times to create this 4 part phrase here. So it's just longer. And then that's essentially the loop, the start that I made. So you can actually loop it here. And then I started out with making a bass line to go with it. I used just a simple sub bass line for it and just played 2 notes here, D and D sharp, back and forth, alternating. It's a very, very simple drum and bass, bass line part to start. And then I did make that little higher note, G higher note after, so that it just takes that step up. So there's one example already, is you may start with a loop of just these 2 things here and have this. And at least for me, this Ableton does, for me at least, crackle when it when it repeats in a loop. So I don't actually use the loop function because it makes that annoying crackling noise. So I'm going to skip that. But that's where you could start out with just these 2 alternating bass notes, which is fairly common in something like drum and bass. You might just have this simple bass that walks up and down and up and down, back and forth. And you start with that and say, okay, that's great. And then I can copy that out. Copy that pattern out 3 times here, but then on the 4th time, for the end of this whole, for the end of this phrase here that we've got here, then for the end of the phrase there, because this group of 4, this is 1 measure, 2 measures, 3 measures. This is 4 measures here. Oh, no, sorry, 2. It's no, sorry, this is 1. What am I saying? 1 measure here. You can see it broken down here at the top, 33 to 34. So this is 1 measure here, 2 measures, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, 7, 8, turning it into that phrase of 8 from DJing and just kind of counting the rhythm. Many of you will know that phrases of 8, 16, and 32 are generally making up the phrases or the sections of a dance music tune based on a grid like that. So that's what we're working with here, is this first loop of 8 bars that we're creating a variation for the last one, for the 8th measure or bar. Measure and bar, same phrase, same thing. But so we have this back and forth repeating bass line here, but then for the last one we create this variation to give it this sense of transition or resolve. You hear that term if you look up in songwriting, that it plays back and forth and then it resolves. There's a transition period here before it starts over again in the next phrase here. So we have this extra high note there with this one, just to give it that difference, because yeah. So I have drums and bass created there. And then I just created another bass sound as like a, some detail, something to be going on in the song here with this sound here. So, and so the way that I chose these notes to start with were just totally arbitrary, just playing around, picking something. I mean, D and D sharp is like really typical minor key sound for this type of music. So it's something very typical. You can start with, or like my approach I mentioned before, of a really simple way to think about music theory, of the question of like, how do I know what notes to play? I really have no idea. Well, you just start playing around on your keyboard, playing and holding some notes and thinking, well, what do I want the vibe, the feeling of this track to be? And that's based on what notes you're playing. So for example, I'll just open up a basic synth here, operator synth, and just start playing some notes with my keyboard. Turn this into a saw wave so you guys can hear it. So I'm just playing random notes here, and I can figure out like, there's this note, that's an E. I could play, you know. And like I said before, you can really just mash around some notes. If you don't know anything about music theory, you can just use your ears and use your feeling that you can tell that something like this feels and sounds very different than something like that, you know? So you can choose what feeling and vibe you want from the notes you're going to select, first of all, as your songwriting technique to start your song, to say, well, what notes do I even want to play? Because if you're playing those notes back and forth, that's obviously very different than the feeling of this one. You know, so just play around and find some notes where you think, okay, I like the way that sounds. So in this case, I chose D and D sharp. Now, if you play those together, the chord theory of playing a chord of the notes together doesn't sound good. But in this case, you're doing a different thing where you're just alternating back and forth for a bass line. Very simple. So that's just what I did for this. And that's a way you can play around with just a basic synth, playing just a simple like init, you know, initialized patch of a saw wave, and just play with some notes until you figure out, huh, that sounds good. I think I will make my track in that key, you know, and with those notes. So with that being done and the bass line being written that way, starting with that, then I use a variation of that, or in other words, the same notes on a different bass patch. And that's a theme we're going to talk about a lot here today as an easy way to begin fleshing out ideas into more things, where you say, okay, I came up with this 2-note bass line and a drum break. It's pretty simple. So what do I do with that? Well, I used a different synth sound. I mean, this is just some random, you know, bassy, Reese bass sound. And I just played the same notes here, D and D sharp back and forth. So there you see, came to the end of the phrase twice here, and I left this open blank space here, and another open blank space here at the end of each 8-bar phrase here, and that is just a common kind of thing in this style of music. Like here, I cut out first we had the variation of the bass playing a high note here. And then in the second 16-bar, the end of the 16-bar phrase here, I just removed the bass note entirely to get this open space. And, you know, typically in that kind of case, you would have, like, say, a different sound playing in that as your kind of fill thing. So let's, I don't know, let's do that. So here, creative hack here, duplicate what you already have. And then I just take the same note that I'm playing here and change the patch on the synth. We'll just change it to something different. Not that. No. Let's just make a random note more to demonstrate the point than anything. No, not that. Okay, whatever. Let's just, you know, init preset, make it wide and do something. And do a filter sweep or something to just make a point. Point being just to make something else that happens in that period. So that's like a common technique, is like alternating between having a couple sounds like a couple synth patches. Like I have this one patch playing here, this line playing. You know, and then you just have something different that plays in that fill, that little spot, to just create the sense of transition, of movement, of change between those phrases, you know. I know I'm making a lame example here, but just to just to illustrate the point. So that is the start of our loop here. Then we basically have this as a loop, you know, that you could start out like I started out just making this project with that, creating the drum part, bass part, and a simple melody to go along with it, and expanding it from the first loop, you know, into a longer 4, 8 bar and then 16 bar phrase with just 2 things of variation to differentiate between the two, rather than having just the same loop playing identically again. So changing it by just removing the bass note here and playing a little third, you know, alternate note here in place of it. And so, yeah, so we already have the, what we could say, okay, I started a project and I have this loop created, and I think that's like the core of the tune I'm writing. So that's, you know, what we have so far. I also decided to I just cut a little bit at the end of the drum phrase there. That's another thing people do a lot, is, you know, change the drum pattern or cut something out at the end of a longer phrase, like a 16 bar or 32 bar phrase, just to create another little sense of another little break in the rhythm here, you know? Like that. So then where do we go from that loop that we have? That's the other question. So from here, I took the notes that we created the track in. That's the important part. We said, okay, this is a D minor. It's minor because of the minor chord, you know, the minor sad sounding, you know, rather than major happy sounding chord based on D. So that's the key that our track is going to be in. So that's what we're writing everything in, is going to be written in D to match it. And then to create a variation of it, I just created another simple synth patch based on that, making the same notes here, D to a D sharp, and played out the same pattern, mirroring the bass line, back and forth, D to D sharp, back and forth. So same notes, different synth patch to create another voice. In this case, I'm not going to go too much into what I created, just something, in this case, something random where I just am playing, you know, more notes. You could hear it if I just initialized the synthesizer, it'd sound like this. Just, so what I did there was I just adjusted the envelope to give it a bit of slope here that fades in. Then the envelope on the filter a bit here, so it just gives that one, you know, fade in over and over into a delay and a reverb, you know, and some EQ. That's it. So again, the concept of taking the same notes we've written the track in to start with, this D, D sharp combo, and then making a new synth part based on that with a new sound to introduce into the second phrase part here. As you can see, I also differentiated it by changing the pattern slightly, where this one, it goes one note, D sharp, D to D sharp, back and forth, like that. Well, here I had it playing the same note twice before switching to the next one. So that's another concept of taking what you already have, the notes you've already written, and the basis of your tune, your root note, and and kind of general pattern you decided on, and creating another variation of it with the variation of the notes. Like in this case, instead of going back and forth each measure, I went back and forth every 2 measures, and then I changed the bass line to reflect that as well. You can see here it's D, and then the next measure D sharp. So this one I did D for 2 measures, D sharp for 2 measures. And then I also made it a different color in the bass to differentiate it. Or in this case, they're the same color, but I just did the rename function and named it number 2, and this one's number 1, so that I can tell the difference between the two. And you can use different colors too, or labels, as a way to help differentiate. Oh, these 2 different. Now you can zoom out and you can clearly see the different sections I'm using in this tune, right? And that can be another songwriting technique to help visualize, like, okay, I've got this main phrase here, I've got this part, and then I've got this part, and then I repeat that part again, and then I repeat the first part again, as you can see. Go 1, 2, 2, 1. So then, after this first section we wrote here, then we go into the second section where I changed the notes to just, change the pattern of the notes, but playing the same stuff, and then made another new synth part to be introduced then too. Just another example too. So I have this repeating pattern back and forth twice here. And then in the second half of the phrase, another common thing to do is, you could say, oh, I'm gonna play that, but just play it an octave higher, so it goes from this. So there, we just introduced a new synth part playing similar notes, the same notes really, but just in a different sound, and changed the order of the notes a bit so that they play for a different length of time as a way to create a variation for a second part. That way, so we've already escaped the loop then, we have the first loop we created, and then we create a second part variation of it where it's just a variation of what we already have. But it gives that sense of change, that feeling, just like here, just like playing this first part, but then rather than repeating the exact same part again, and play it up an octave, Or you could do that just in the very end part. You could just repeat this again, but then just go up for the final, fourth part of the whole phrase. And then repeating it into the variation. So then we're playing that second part again, copying it again, but this time playing a new synth part. So in this case, I took the same synth part we had here and just duplicated it to here. And then it's the same thing, but I add an arpeggiator to it. So just instead of just playing these notes back and forth, I put an arpeggiator on it. To have a variation of a new voice that plays, again, similar part, just differently. I use the arpeggiator in this case to, give it another variety, but still from playing the same notes. And I also automated the filter sweep up to just sweep the filter up from this low. Another thing to add movement. Another way to add movement and change to something over time so you don't just have the same exact loop playing over and over again is, of course, automating things like automating a filter movement, automating, the amount of an effect it gets sent to. I mean, I could also automate the dry wet amount for this so that it really, gets totally drenched in reverb towards the end of it and kind of fades out. Delay, sorry. But yeah, by automating things, giving it some movement is another way to add escaping the loop, and to give change over time to something. So I did that for this part. And then, to be very creative, just went back and repeated the same part again. Because we did our first intro drop here to introduce the theme of the song, We have our second part where we changed it up a little bit, added a new synth voice. Third part where we did the same thing but with a new synth voice. And then a little transition here where I cut the drums and the bass and everything to give it that transition feel, and then back to the first part. Yeah, boom, back to the main theme, The main theme before we cut to the break here. Because we played our 1-bar loop. We played our 1-bar, 2-bar loop into 4 bars, into 8, into 16, and then we did that 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So we have a nice even 4-part verse that plays out, and then we cut to a break. So the break is like what I did with the intro. So the intro, I also just made like a pad-like sound, a non-aggressive sound for the intro, using, again, that same pattern of the D sharp that we had already been working with, and just created a synth variation for that here. Just to have a little intro variety. And then played that for 1 full phrase here. And then the second phrase here, I introduced the drums, but with a filter on it. See, I have an auto filter here on the drums, and I'm automating the power button to turn that filter off for the main drop, so that the filter's only on during this part that we're using in the intro and in the break. So just creating a variation of what we already have coming from the whole loop that we started with. So in this case, I should say too, obviously all of these things are not like the full, complete, fleshed out version of what you'd actually be doing in a serious production. For example, with this intro thing of just having this little sound, I mean, I'd probably want more than that going on, right? But that's a good way to start. So we could start and we could just take that and say duplicate it. And then, let's see, go in and turn these into one long note instead of a repeating note, turn it into one long note. And then do the same for this. So now we have, and then change the sound. Let's change it to a saw wave, Oh, we have the filter envelope going on here. Let's just turn it. yeah, see, just creating a variation from the pattern. I'll duplicate it and make the notes an octave higher. Create some variation that way for it. So. I will put in the arpeggiator part. Oh, because I duplicated this. I'm going to get rid of all, because I duplicated the rest of that too. That was our arpeggiator part here. Okay, we got our arpeggiator part here. I'll take a copy of part of that. Oops, just an even section of it. Copy part of that, put it into the end of this so that it comes in this last part. I'm actually going to copy this part of it because it had the filter automation higher, set higher. So, oh no, what am I doing? I will copy both parts of it and make it play for this full half of that phrase. Yeah, so just like introducing another part of it, what we already have. Yeah, so I created another variation of it using the same notes that we started with. Again, variation of what we started with, what we have, into an intro part, something that's just more suitable for the intro, like a lighter, less abrasive, less intense, version of the same kind of thing. And then when I have that created, I just reused it for the breakdown in the middle then. Yeah, just reuse. Well, I mean, and I would recommend you could make the breakdown in the middle not exactly the same as the intro and stuff. That's kind of lazy. But I mean, essentially, you could just do like a callback to the to the intro and do something just like that again. In this case, I introduced this part again here in the second half of the breakdown. And I introduced a vocal sample, just some random, TV sample or something like that here. Doesn't really matter what. Just point being that this could be, you can just introduce another sound that way randomly here when this second half of the first, break drops here. So we played that first part for the breakdown, which is just like we did in the first part of the intro here. And then in the second part, I just the same as it again, where this goes up an octave here. And then I introduced this first synth part from the verse into this again here, and then put in a little fill snippet of the arpeggiator part there. And again, with the drums with filter on it again, being turned back on for the breakdown part here. You'll notice again, I was just fixing that part where I put this little fill, this little transition, extra bass sound to the end of the phrase here, and cut the drums a little bit, the bass there, just like we did in the first part here. I wouldn't actually just do the exact same thing again, but that being said, to make the second drop different, we could do that, that one here, and just make a copy of it and do something different with it here and make a different bass sound. I don't know, something else. And like a whatever, Yeah, the point being, making some variation and alternating between them. And you could say, well, I have one end of phrase transition here, I have another end of phrase one here, and then a third one here, so I could make another variation of that here, just another something else, I mean, I'm just being super, quick with this, obvious, just to do examples, but, something. Just showing that like you'd have a different, you have different parts playing in each part of that. So you're not just repeating the same sound over and over and over again. And yeah, to also change it up for the second drop of the tune, then the second half, I just changed the order up. You can see from the colors here. Instead, I put the part 2, started with part 2, and then went to part 1, and then back to part 2 and back to part 1. Did that here too, you can see. Part 2, 1, 2, 1, and first it was 1, 2, 2, 1. Again, yeah, just made variation. Just made variation to change it up here. Go put this here and that there like that. Yeah, again, just taking out those transition parts like that. So yeah, I just reused what I did for the first half of the tune for the second half and just changed up the variation a bit so that when the second drop hits, it's not like, oh, it's exactly the same as the first one. And now it's just a different tune. So there, yeah, you can see I changed the order of the main patterns for the second part, like I said, having pattern 2, doing 2, 1, 2, 1 instead of 1, 2, 2, 1. And then also changed the order of the additional synth parts playing, where we started with this one, then went to this one, then to that one, just changing the order of how they were played. Oh no, this was a new song. No, a new part. So I introduced, for part 2, I introduced another new synth sound, but again, just a variation playing the same pattern. Now, and this isn't saying, oh, you should display the exact same patterns for all these synth parts, obviously, but I'm just demonstrating that even with a very similar pattern, you can make some variation to it. Obviously, it would be encouraged. But even with a very similar or the same pattern using a different sound, you can still achieve, you still have the effect of just introducing a new part that adds something new and different to that section of the tune. So for this one, what did I do here? I had another arpeggiated part and square wave and just changed it a little bit here for filter automation. Just made another variation of a similar sound, and it just is giving that additional change to a part where the second part of the tune drops and you hear a new song, you hear a new synth part, and you're like, oh, that one's new. that wasn't in the first part, So that's again how I created a second part variation here for the second half of the tune, after the first one, but based on it entirely, just with different arrangement, different order, and introducing a new sound to give it additional variety, maybe changing the ones that already existed, and then letting it play out for another 4 sections here, which again not everything in the arrangement has to be like exactly symmetrical, like 2-bar intro or two section intro. This is a 32 bar section. You can see here 16, 32 up the top here, but not everything has to be this symmetrical and square of having like 2 section intro, 4 section verse, 2 section breakdown, 4 section B part, and then 2 section outro. I'm just using that as the most basic, simple example of how you can think of building this into, a full tune, because here we are, 5-minute tune, with our 2 parts here, intro, breakdown, outro, drop A, drop B, everything. There we go, really simple. And that's just to illustrate the point of how you can build out something from the simple loop concept, into a full fleshed out tune without thinking, oh God, how do I do that even, And then again, for the outro, we just used a variety of the intro, basically, but without one of the synths, and then adding another one in here, and adding the vocal sample thing back into it. So it's just, this. Yeah, and now that I hear that, I would actually cut out, we don't need the second part, and just get rid of that entirely, because it's just the outro. It's just this one phrase of the outro. And yeah, that's basically it. That's a real quick and easy example of how you can start with something really simple like the 1 section loop here that we started with. And built it out into, well, this full tune, without putting too much thought into it, to just give the example of how we create that 1 loop, and then we extend it out into 1 phrase with some variation here on the end, and then we double that phrase into a longer complete phrase of 16 bars with variation on the end there, here, and then we create a variation of that, something same but different for a B, a B part, and then we create another variation of that, and then went back to the same first phrase here to just repeat that again, and then use the same root note concepts we started, the notes that we started the whole tune with, this D, D sharp back and forth, a very simple thing, to create additional synth voices based on that pattern. by just creating variation with the different voices, and created an intro and a break using the same intro ideas, giving some variation to that. And then the B part of the whole tune, the second drop, by just using what we had in the first drop, keeping that familiarity going of, the identity of the tune, but creating some variation just with different arrangement, and then introducing a new synth part here to add something totally new for the second part. New for the second half, I mean. And then changing the order, the arrangement of the synth parts so that they don't just play exactly the same again. And then creating the outro, with a variation of the intro. So variation, that's the word of the day. The main theme you're probably sensing, already is variation is the kind of lesson of this topic here of how to flesh an idea out into something more full without feeling like you're lost with really no idea how to do that. If you come up with one idea that you can start with as like your main kind of starting point, or your loop or something, or your main idea, and then you can create variation on that to expand into a full piece, because that's a really solid and common concept, honestly, with creating variation of a main theme. That way the theme of the tune stays consistent and the identity of it stays really similar, but it's not just the same thing over and over again. Of course, you have variation on that theme created. So yeah, I hope that was helpful as a intro to these topics of songwriting and how do I, escape the loop, so to speak, and all that. These are, again, like most things I've been teaching in these videos, are fundamental basic concepts and theories that are the starting points for more advanced ones. So just like all of the other things have been, this is something where it's a really basic, first and foremost basic example of this way of thinking, but then you can expand on these concepts greatly to develop more complex and sophisticated ideas and arrangements, and take it from there, because there's obviously unlimited possibilities with what you could do. But those unlimited possibilities can also be quite overwhelming sometimes when you think, oh, there's so much I could do. What should I do? This is a real basic concept starting point for approaching that. So I hope you found it helpful. Again, of course, any questions, comments, concerns, etc., just hit me up. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. And so, yeah, thanks. Thanks for joining me, and see you in the next one.